Ukrainian Institute, in collaboration with the Ukrainian Jewish Institute, is pleased to present the book Jews and Ukrainians, A Millennium of Coexistence, authored by Paul Robert Magocsi and Johann Jews and Ukrainians, Myths and Stereotypes. There is much that Ukrainians do not know about Jews, and that Jews do not know about Ukrainians. As a result, Jews and Ukrainians who care about their respective ancestral heritages often view each other through distorted stereotypes, misperceptions, and biases. Professor Robert Magocsi, Paul Robert Magocsi, will shed new light on the controversial issues in Ukrainian-Jewish relations, including questions of anti-Semitism, and argue that cultural and historical experiences do not only divide ethnic Ukrainians and Jews, but also brought them together. Paul Robert Magocsi is professor of history and political science at the University of Toronto. Since 1980, he has held the endowed John Yarenko Chair of Ukrainian Studies. He is the author of over 800 works, including 40 books, primarily in the fields of political, cultural, religious history, sociolinguistics, bibliography, cartography, immigration, and ethnic studies. The moderator for this evening will be Adrian Karatnycky. Adrian Karatnycky is a member of the National Advisory Board of the Ukrainian Institute of America and a member of the Board of Directors of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in the United States. From 1993 to 2003, he was president of Freedom House. He was a frequent contributor to Foreign Affairs, Newsweek, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and so on and so on. He is the co-author of 3 books on Soviet and post-Soviet themes. And now, I guess I will hand over the podium to Professor Magocsi.
Let me do a little bit of a preamble. Just to kind of explain what we're going to do. Professor Magocsi will briefly speak to us for about 20 minutes. Then we'll engage in a bit of a conversation. And I think this is an interesting time to think about the Ukrainian-Jewish relationship because the Ukrainian-Jewish relationship is at the center, or perhaps not at the center, but that's also very interesting, of a Ukrainian presidential election. The front runner in the Ukrainian presidential election is someone of Jewish origin, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is leading the incumbent president and the former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, and is almost certain to make it into the runoff, with one of the other two as their challengers. And the most interesting thing is if he were to be elected, Ukraine, apart from Israel, would be the only country in the world ever to have had simultaneously a president and a prime minister of Jewish origin. Even more wonderful and interesting thing is that this is not an issue for Ukrainians. It's not an issue of, maybe on the fringes there are a few off-color remarks, but I have to say that even the Ukrainian, I don't mean to joke about it, but even the Ukrainian far right is not engaging in anti-Semitism around the fact of this gentleman's campaign. They're actually hounding the incumbent president for other reasons. We can explore we will explore the nature of the relationship. I believe Professor Magocsi will also speak about the beginnings of the evolution of a Ukrainian Jewish identity. And we'll have a chance after his introductory remarks to explore a range of issues. Then we'll, after maybe about 15 or 20 minutes, we'll throw it open for questions. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Good evening. We'll take advantage, well, the microphone is working, take advantage of a podium. And since I've been asked to say a few words of substance, before we get into another level of substance, but in a more laid-back, conversational tone. What I would like to say for a few moments has to do with the question of Jews living in Ukrainian territory, in particular how they are identified, and also, which I think is exceedingly important, the regional differentiation. In fact, the very topic of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which is the organization that we represent, and that is the sponsor of the volume that some of you have seen, and perhaps some of you already have. This topic has, from the very outset, raised several conceptual problems. First, we can pose the question, can one legitimately speak of Ukrainians and speak of Jews as if they are distinct, self-perceived corporate entities, whether in the past or in the present? In other words, do individuals that others define as Ukrainians or Jews, do those individuals actually feel themselves to be a part of a group? And do they somehow act in their daily lives in a way that somehow reflects or represents so-called group or characteristics or ethnic characteristics or even national characteristics? And what do we mean by Jews in Ukraine? Or Ukrainian Jews? Is there such a phenomenon? And if so, then how does one define that phenomenon? And what are Ukrainians? Persons with a definable Ukrainian ethno-linguistic characteristics, specifically ethnic Ukrainian characteristics, or are Ukrainians all persons, regardless of their ethno-linguistic origin, who are citizens of a state today called Ukraine? Now, for our discussion here, let us adopt some definitions. I always tell my colleagues, students and colleagues in any talk, we have to begin with defining what the terms that we're using, whether one agrees with the definition or not. At least one will know what one is saying when one is using the term. Namely, that the term Ukrainian here refers to a group whose members speak Ukrainian and or identify as belonging to the Ukrainian nationality. Now, in general, if using that definition, I prefer to use the term ethnic Ukrainian, and that's because one needs to distinguish, based on what I just said about ethno-linguistic characteristics, Ukrainians in that sense from citizens of Ukraine, who, as I already alluded, technically include the country's entire population, regardless of that population or individual ethno-linguistic or national background. The terms Jews in Ukraine, or Ukrainian Jews, at first glance would seem much easier to define. Namely, the terms refer to persons of Jewish religion or heritage, who were born or who live in Ukraine. But what about Jews of the historic past, who lived at a time when Ukraine as a state did not exist? Well, today, with these remarks, as well as for us in the Jewish-Ukrainian encounter, a rather, let us say, anachronistic approach that will be adopted. That is, persons of Jewish background are designated as Ukrainian Jews or Jews from Ukraine if they have resided at some point in history, at any time, on the territory of present-day Ukraine, whether from the earliest times to the present, and regardless whether a state called Ukraine existed when the Jews in question lived there. Now, such an understanding does not, not necessarily coincide with how each of the groups in question has proceeded. Instead, there's a kind of perceptual disconnect. On the one hand, ethnic Ukrainians consider their historic homeland to have always been Ukraine, a territory which only in the course of the 20th century, however, became a clearly defined and eventually independent state. On the other hand, the Jews in question are part of a worldwide diaspora, one branch of which, called Ashkenazim, had until recently inhabited large parts of Central and Eastern Europe, including areas which, from their perspective, have only recently become Ukraine. In those cases where some more specific territorial origin is called for, the general and often vague terms that one encounters to depict the places where Ukrainian Jews lived are the Pale of Settlement, Russia, in more recent times, Soviet Union, or in the case of Hasidic adherents, actually no geographic place at all. Who cares about it? Isn't there geography, or even past it? Well, the geography of this earth. Rather, they prefer to associate with some rabbinic dynasty. They're associated with such as the Belts, or the Bratslav, or the Savran, Unka, Ruzhin, Sadagor, etc., etc. Some Jews also may identify with a specific region, such as Galicia, Galiciana, Bukovina, Carpathian Rus, Crimea, in Charts. The point here is that for Jews, the very concept of a Ukraine is very rarely mentioned as any kind of identifier to describe the origins either of themselves or their ancestors. Rather, Russian Jew, Polish Jew, Soviet Jew, Galiciana, Krimchak, or a Belzer Munkach, a dynastic follower. Almost anything else, but not the descriptor Ukrainian Jew. Now, various regional and country names do, nonetheless, reflect real differences with what we are defining here as Ukrainian Jewry. In many ways, the Jewish cultural mindset derives from geopolitical structures that date from the late 18th century up until World War I. And that period began with the late 1780s, 1700s, the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. After the end of that in 1795, Poland-Lithuania ceased to exist, and those lands which until that time had belonged to the former Commonwealth were annexed to the Russian Empire and became part of what was known as that Pale of Settlement that I referred to. This Pale of Settlement encompasses present-day countries of Lithuania, Belarus, most of Ukraine. What about the Pale of Settlement is that it had the highest number of Ashkenazic Jews anywhere in the world. There are nearly 4 million Jews in the Pale who lived there in 1897, which is the first Russian census, and including also the estimated 2 million who emigrated from there to North America, especially in the northeastern part of the United States, between 1897 and 1917. They describe themselves and their descendants do to this day as Jews from Russia, or Russian Jews. Now, the Pale referred to those imperial Russian provinces, several in Ukraine, where Jews were permitted to reside. Why? Because with only very few exceptions, the Russian imperial government banned Jews from residing beyond the pale. That's where this expression comes from. This was only those lands that the Russian Empire had just got from Poland, Lithuania. They didn't want them in the rest of Russia. Even within the pale, there were various restrictions on where Jews could reside. And beginning in the 1880s, they were temporarily banned from moving as first-time residents to rural villages. Couldn't even do that. It was also within the Pale, and specifically in those Tsarist provinces that were located in Ukraine, present-day Ukraine, where the anti-Jewish pogroms of 1881-82 took place. Now, those pogroms or the loss of life was actually minimal in comparison to either previous or subsequent pogroms. But nonetheless, most historians consider the years 1881-82, and I'll quote a Jewish historian here, Benjamin Harshal, quote, as a major watershed in the history of Jewish culture and consciousness. Why? Because it was those events which set in motion large-scale emigration abroad, and which convinced many secular Jewish intellectuals that the survivor of their community must ultimately be sought elsewhere, whether by going to America, or for some, preferably, returning, making aliyah to Eretz Israel. Now, despite restrictions on where to live, periodic violence, there was a major pogrom in Kishinev in 1903, this is not in Ukraine, it's in present-day Moldova. Nonetheless, there were places within the Pale where Jewish communities continued to flourish and even increase in size. Particularly the case of the Crimean Peninsula, where beginning in the 1880s, Ashkenazim from other parts of Ukraine and the Pale began to settle in large numbers alongside Turkic-speaking Krimchak Jews and Karaites, whose Crimean communities, those communities stayed from way back in the 13th century. Now, in stark contrast to the Jews living in the Russian Empire's Pale of settlement, were those residents in present-day Ukrainian territory who found themselves, after the 1770s, in the Habsburg-ruled Austro-Hungarian Empire. Just like in Imperial Russia's Pale of settlement, a very high percentage of Jews were among the inhabitants of the provinces of Galicia and Bukovina, within the so-called Austrian half of the Habsburg realm, and also in the historic region of Carpathian Rus in the so-called Hungarian half of that realm. Now, Jews in these areas, that is, under Habsburg rule, were able to reap the advantages of Emperor Joseph II's reforms in the 1780s and 1780s, 1770s and 1780s, providing them with legal equality, because all citizens were made legal, equal, that is, equal before the law, regardless of their religion. And these, in that sense, emancipated Jews were able to take advantage of the full freedom of movement and settlement anywhere in the empire. Stark contrast to what was farther east in the Russian Empire. And that allowed many of them, among other things, to improve their economic status. The more enterprising of these Jews in Habsburg, Austria-Hungary, flocked to universities, particularly the medical and legal professions, in which Jews excelled within the pre-World War I Austria-Hungary. And when in the 1880s, the danger of pogroms rocked the southern part of the Russian Empire, neighboring Ukraine, Jews from the east, from Russia's Pale settlement, sought permanent refuge by crossing the border and settling where, at least initially, in Austrian-ruled Galicia and Bukovina. Now, when those two empires, the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire, ceased to exist in the last years of World War I, the Jews then found themselves, that is, the Jews of present-day Ukraine, now after World War I, found themselves in 4 new states: the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Those who were in the former Russian Empire were now in Bolshevik-ruled Soviet Ukrainian Republic, the Soviet Union. Soviet policies toward them had both a positive and negative impact. On the one hand, religious Jews and their institutions were persecuted, as were most religious groups, all actually, by the early Bolsheviks. Petty merchants and retail shop owners made up a significant portion of the Jewish population of the old Russian Empire, were put out of business, literally. But on the other hand, Soviet law lifted all legal restrictions against Jews as a group, with the result that hundreds of thousands were able to make successful careers in Soviet institutions, whether in government, university, with scholarly research, also in Bolshevik-run industrial management sector. Now, those Jews from Ukraine, present-day Ukraine, in the former Austro-Hungarian lands, as I said, found themselves after World War I in Poland. Russia was next to it, Romania, Bukovina was next to it, Czechoslovakia, Greece was next to it. And during the subsequent interwar years of the 20th century, the pre-World War I Habsburg tolerance was replaced by restrictions, especially in higher educational institutions, against the Jews of Polish-ruled Galicia and Romanian-ruled Bukovina. Only exception was in democratic Czechoslovakia, where Jews were able to achieve economic, social, and educational advancement that was not even available in pre-World War I Habsburg Hungary. Now, what are the conclusions that we can draw from what I've just said? What recommendations may be made on the basis of what I've just said? Well, the first conclusion has to do with the very formulation, Ukrainian Jewry. If we are to use that concept as an analytical tool, then we also at the same time must accept the fact of Ukraine's regional diversity and the significant impact of that diversity on the country's Jewish inhabitants. Clearly, the frequently negative experience of Jews in Russia's Pale of settlement during the 19th century is not even remotely the same as the flourishing world of Galician and Bukovinian Jewish life under Habsburg rule in the neighboring Austro-Hungarian Empire. For instance, I always like to tell this tale to my students of how during World War I, the very outbreak of World War I in August 1914, the Russian Empire, Tsarist Russian forces invaded Galicia very quickly, and large numbers of Jews fled from Galicia to Bukovina. This is now the winter of 1914-1915, which is one of the coldest winters on record, and they had nowhere to go. And so the emperor, old Emperor Franz Joseph, put them up in the Winter Palace. And his government was shocked. What? These are my people. These are my Jews. They have to be taken care of. So the situation also in the Hungarian Empire is radically different. Very often, however, people forget these differences. And all becomes bad. So whereas pogroms and characteristic occurrences at certain times in the 19th, 20th century in many parts of Ukraine, as well as in Eastern and Central Europe in general, one territory, actually Transcarpathia, never experienced pogroms or even other forms of violence, which some Jewish historians classify as excesses. Now, a somewhat related conclusion and recommendation is what I would suggest is the need to move away from the simplistic notion that the historical past of Eastern European Jewry is little more than the story of unmitigated tragedy. One Jewish American scholar, Stephen Zipperstein, best summed up this problem in an essay on Holocaust historiography. Good to remember what here he says, and I quote, "In the absence of historical work, in the wake of fierce, definitive immigrant memories, and memories not reality, about what life back there was like, and in the aftermath of the Shoah, pervasive premonitions of horrors regarding Eastern Europe were conflated and granted a grim prescience. Nazi horrors and Tsar's pogroms meshed in the often sparse, repetitive narratives the Jews tended to tell about this vast, complex region." So, for instance, the distance, he goes on, the distance between life in Vilna, the incredibly intellectual, productive world epitomized by the Interwar Evil Institute, and death in Treblinka, tended to narrow in such accounts as if these were just differences in detail and not substance. Now, to the degree that Ukraine is part of this Eastern European world, the manner in which its very name is treated becomes symptomatic of what this Zipperstein says, and therefore a matter of concern. Alas, stereotypes are hard to overcome, especially when they are embedded in the cultural discourse that goes back centuries. And so the medieval designation in Jewish sources for all the Slavic lands in Central and Eastern Europe, and that includes all of Ukraine, was Canaan, a term derived from Canaan, with the implication that it was the land of slaves. And as Max Weinrich has reminded us, the history of Yiddish and the history of the Ashkenaz are identical. But not in all periods, nor in all places, did European Jews speak Yiddish. And I was particularly struck by Hashav's discussion on a book called The Meaning of Yiddish, where he lists the various other languages used by Europe's Jews, from Italian to Russian to English and many others. It's interesting that Hashav's list excludes, however, one otherwise very influential language, which was not only spoken by large numbers of Ashkenazim, but also was one which had an important impact on the later development of Yiddish. That unmentionable language, not in Hashav's list, was Ukrainian. Since traditionally most Jews refer to it not by its name, as they did Polish or Dutch or Czech, but they simply called it Hoydysh. Even within the Jewish world itself, the unmentionable Ukrainian lands took on especially negative characteristics. I have in mind here the Galiciana, the term used to describe not only the Jews of the historic province of Austrian Galicia, but also, at least in terms of Yiddish dialects, Jews living farther east in right bank Ukraine. In contrast to the ultimately superior German Jews, and even though these are Easterners, the more sophisticated Litvaks, the term Galiciana, to quote the recent Evil Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe, is a cultural identifier bearing for the most part negative connotations, and I quote, a troublemaker, a shrewd operator, a money grubber, a religious fanatic, a spineless compromiser, a speaker of popular vulgar Yiddish, and someone ashamed of his or her origins who liked to pose as an Austrian. Now, names, nomenclature, the way things are called, have enormous symbolic as well as instrumental value. The subject of this inquiry then should be Ukrainian Jews or the Jews of Ukraine. And while we're at it, place names, where the towns or historic regions should reflect usage in the country where they are located today. Now, it's true that we should be aware of the reality of numerous name variants for virtually every city, town, and village in Central and Eastern Europe, but out of respect for present-day realities, not to mention practical matters, to try to find these places, I would suggest we consider using Ukrainian names for places within the borders of Ukraine. One would think it's the obvious, but actually it's not. And to take just one of many possible examples, we should not be afraid to use Lviv, perhaps with the Yiddish alternatives Lemberg or Lvov in parentheses, but not Polish Lvov or Russian Lvov. And with regard to historic regions, the more accurate Kievan Rus should be used, not Kievan Russia. Being more sensitive to terminology and its consistent use would, at the very least, be of help in our common efforts to eliminate unnecessary and, at times, harmful misperceptions. So I'll stop here, and I will turn the floor back over to my colleague, Adrian Karatnycky. Thank you.
So we have a little bit of scene setting, but let me add a little bit more to make it a little more frequent, because I think that you are scratching the surface methodologically of what you do in the book and what the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter has been trying to do in a series of, there will be a major museum exhibit at the Royal Ontario Museum in about a year and a half. Did a community exhibit that traveled throughout Canada in Jewish and Ukrainian community centers. Publication that derived from it is part of this. We host a number of different events, and we deal with hard historical issues. We have a series of dialogues with scholars and historians and political scientists about the near past and the distant past. We engage Ukrainian leaders, diaspora leaders, and so on. And one of the have missions that connect Jewish writers and Israeli writers with Ukrainian counterparts and diaspora counterparts. So a rich program that seeks to explore all these dimensions that are addressed in the book. And I think it's just worth remembering a number of important things about the territory of Ukraine in Jewish life. It is the cradle of Hasidism. It is the place where, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the only place where Hebrew books were published. It was actually in Zhokwa. It's a place of great literary figures in Yiddish history, Sholem Aleichem among them. It is also a place of, as you alluded to and mentioned, of tragedy, of war. It is what Ukraine is what Timothy Snyder has spoken about as a place of horror that begins in the early 1930s with the Stalin terror and famine, which incidentally leads to the loss of tens of thousands of Jews as well as many millions of Ukrainians, something that is not readily recognized. And on the other side, Ukraine is the territory of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, where 2 million Jews who were then a part of what was before the Nazi occupation, Poland and the Soviet Union, 2 million Jews perished. But at the same time, less well known is that 5 million non-Jews of Ukrainian ancestry or citizens of what would today be Ukraine perished as prisoners of war, as victims of the conflict, and as combatants in fighting the Nazi occupation, both from the Soviet side and also the resistance that occurred in that period. To be sure, there are also the issues of collaboration. There are issues of the emergence of the two independent states, Israel predating Ukraine by about 3 decades. Nevertheless, relatively young states that are seeking their identity and tracing some of their roots. So Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky made common cause with Ukrainian political leaders in the early 20th century, arguing that both that Russification and Polonization were both dangerous forces that lead to the loss of identity, and that both nations, Ukrainians and Jews, have a common cause in resisting them. Ukrainians, like Jews, shared the problem of Russification, the banning of texts. Under the Soviet Union, they faced the common issue of the eradication of their religious traditions. We often discuss the issues of the Jewish participation in reasonably large numbers in the Bolshevik movement and in the communist movement of the early years, but we neglect to remember that these were secular Jews who had been pushed away from their religious and cultural identities over many decades and by different kinds of forces, and were themselves the instruments of repression of religious Jews and of traditional Jews, just as in a sense Ukrainians were, who were also have lost their identities and were fighting for a world revolution, became instruments for the repression of Ukrainians who tried to preserve their language, their religious faith, their culture, their identity in the Soviet and in the Bolshevik periods. So there's a lot there, and there's a lot of it in the book that you and Johanna Magocsi Stern did, and I just wanted to do it as a little bit of a preamble, and I'll ask a couple very specific questions. So let's start that one of the it seems to me that today in the Ukrainian Jewish and in the Ukrainian Israeli relationship, there are very few current contemporary issues of great controversy. The level of anti-Semitism in Ukrainian society is pretty low. There was a Pew study that showed that of all the South, Central, and East European countries, Ukrainians were the most accepting of Jewish participation in the leader. I would say biased in terms of Jewish membership in their civic nation, or in their perception of the national Ukrainian identity. We have, as I mentioned, the phenomenon of the elections, the fairly substantial and robust participation of Jewish politicians in Jewish Ukrainian politicians in life, in Ukrainian political life, and more importantly, the Israeli-Ukrainian relationship is quite strong. Memorialization of the tragedies of Baba Yar and of the Holocaust are part of Ukrainian, occur with the participation of Ukrainian state leaders. But there is, the further we go into the past, the deeper is the sort of what you call memory, but also the controversies. The controversies, I think, are at their peak about the issue of collaboration. And maybe we might start with that issue. As a historian, how do you see Ukraine and Ukrainians' role in the Second World War? Some Ukrainians participated. How does it compare on a regional basis, on a broader basis? And how do you think the discussion of the historical past is occurring among not just scholars but politicians of say, Israel and Ukraine?
I guess I might preface before addressing that question, the following observation. I'm not certain that for the vast majority of people in any part of the world, and this includes Ukraine and the United States and Canada, that history is all that important. I'm saying this as a historian who's practiced the profession for close to half a century and who shares matters of the historical past with younger generations. Most people in whatever walk of life and in whatever society don't really concern themselves with historical matters unless they are somehow directly insulted or attacked, and then they may raise their hackles and come up with some stereotypical thoughts that they either learned in elementary school or more likely saw in a television program or film. But generally, these matters are not of concern. And I also would say up front now that even the exercise that we are engaged in, and I'm grateful to Adrian for having provided a summary of many of the issues that are in this book and in other projects that the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter engages in. But this is really, I would say, a concern primarily of peoples in the diaspora, and also of a certain age. The vast majority of younger people, whether in North America and certainly in Ukraine, don't think about these things at all. And I see that when I lecture and we have discussions about this book in Ukraine. The younger generation, which to my mind is the only generation that counts, and you're a younger generation if you're younger than 30. So we're basically all over the hill, and some of us very far over the hills in this room. Maybe you're not. I don't have my glasses, so I can't tell. But you don't look like you all. After all, I can see. So here we are in the diaspora, being concerned with this historical past, and then wondering the degree to which it is an issue in present-day Ukraine. So, for those who are professionally engaged in looking at the historical past of a post-Soviet society, a post-Soviet society that for all of the Soviet period, many aspects of their historical past were either whitewashed, those famous white spots or blank spots were never being discussed. Now some of these are not only allowed to be discussed, but are taken up seriously by some scholars. I would say that in general, the historiography that we have been seeing coming out of Ukraine is also a split between generations. So you have the standard Soviet historians, Soviet-trained historians still producing textbooks and monographs with the old cliches about the historic past that were determined for them by Soviet policy, ideological policy. But then there's a whole host of younger historians who are looking afresh, and not only historians, but also journalists, publicists, etc., looking afresh at some very sensitive issues. And among those sensitive issues, is World War II. And World War II, where if one is going to look at it, one looks at it not to really understand the World War II period, but rather to justify an internal need to feel that I, and not I directly because I didn't even live during World War II, but my parents and my grandparents, and therefore my whole people are victims. And that this victimization that was imposed upon my people, my familial forebears, and therefore indirectly on me, has not been given enough attention. And so very often when some attention is given to another people, well, what about us? It was interesting that you have on the top of your head figures of how many people of Jewish background were killed in Ukraine during World War II, and how many non-Jews were killed during World War II. I mean, that sort of sticks in your mind. Well, why does it stick in your mind? Well, because for all intents and purposes, it's not only them that got liquidated, but us too that got liquidated. It's the victimization game. It's that aspect of history, quite frankly, that is not healthy. Now, with regard, however, again, to the specific question of collaboration. And what does collaboration mean? It's a term that generally, stereotypically implies that an outside invader came into the country and the locals cooperated with it, this outside invader, to dominate their own people, to dominate their own land, and did so usually for some kind of advantage, whether that advantage would be monetary, whether that would be advantage by a certain position in society, which was related to monetary, whether it would be related to an advantage to be gotten from revenge against your enemy, whoever your enemy may have been, a communist, your next door neighbor who didn't pay you back some money, or a Jew, or a gypsy, or some other person of a national background that you happen not to like. But today in Ukraine there are several people, ethnic Ukrainians, non-ethnic Ukrainians, professional scholars, who are looking at this issue, trying to determine how one should most properly use the term collaboration. And by the way, there's a whole 2-page discussion of what collaboration means or doesn't mean in this book, Jews and Ukrainians, with quotations about how different people understand it. But I believe there's actually a healthy discussion of this. And the answer to the question, did ethnic Ukrainians and did peoples of other background in Ukraine contribute to the arrests minimally, assist in invading German forces in Ukraine that had singled out Jews and other undesirables for liquidation? Did some members of the local population assist this? Of course they did. I mean, I guess we knew that a long time ago. And besides, you don't have to be a rocket scientist that inevitably this is going to happen. And the question of how it happened, why it happened, what percentage, is being seriously now researched in a way that it couldn't have been done because archives were either not accessible during Soviet period, or even if they were, we couldn't write about it. And then, of course, at the same time, if you're going to look at people who participated in the attacks and assistance toward the liquidation of Jews, then, by the same token, one has to be balanced and look at all of those ethnic Ukrainians and other citizens of non-ethnic Ukrainian background, but non-Jews in Ukraine, who went out of their way at great danger to themselves to save their neighbors, their friends, their religious debaters, if you will, as in the case of Shatitsky, Metropolitan Shatitsky, who had a lot of friends among Jewish rabbis and intellectuals, went out of their way to save them at great risk to their own life. And again, we know that I think it's Ukraine is number 4 or number 5 of all of the countries in the world in Yad Vashem who have for the number of people who are among the righteous. So these kinds of issues are being discussed in a more sophisticated way in Ukraine today. A rather long-winded answer to your question.
Well, let me, without debating you, let me just make an observation, and that is there is something else I think that's in common between the state of Israel and Ukraine, and that is more recent experience post-World War of existential threats to both these states. In Israel, the Six-Day War was a close call, as it were, before it turned out very well. But in Ukraine, the loss of territory, invasion, and so on. And so it seems to me that you're right that perhaps dwelling on victimization is one thing, but understanding existential threats and understanding that they go in the recent past and deeper into the past is probably a natural reaction of societies that face these kinds of traumas. Now, of course, Ukraine had no discussion of its history, including the Holodomor. And in the case of the Jewish community, there was a sort of a post-traumatic experience that for many years, the details of the Holocaust were not mined and explored in any substantial degree, certainly in the first decade.
Including in North America, because they had a real big problem getting the show on the agenda, on the intellectual agenda.
Exactly. I mean, there were signal events like the Nuremberg trials, but then there was no real discussion of the human side of this. This came later, and I think Ukraine is trying to explore world history and so on and so forth. But there's one issue that has become fairly sensitive, and it creates an endless stream of articles, and that is the naming of streets and places in the names of mainly Ukrainian nationalists from the Second World War, which usually result in an article in Haaretz or somewhere with a stream of discussions and condemnation, etc. What I think is missing is the context. Ukraine has changed tens of thousands of place names, and a very small number of them have been named for these particular historical figures. But if you're in Israel and you read that this town or this city named a street, you don't know that 100 other streets were named for completely other, and may have been named for Jewish public figures and so on, where the Soviet names are being removed. And often the absence of context creates this kind of misperception or tension. Although there is, and then there is the sort of the paradox that many Jews would not know that someone like Stefan Bandera spent years in a German concentration camp, and that 4,000 members of his movement were executed by the Nazis, and there was an extermination campaign against the organization Ukrainian Nationalists as an unreliable entity. These are the kind of complexities of the nuances of history that are often missing. But I do think, in my view, it is important for societies to know both their moral strengths and their moral failings, and that relates to the Jewish community, to the ethnic Ukrainian community.
Two things I come away with that I'll perhaps comment on based said. One has to do with more contemporary developments and the relationship or the impressions that Jews have of Ukraine, pardon, let me rephrase that, Israelis, which is different, that Israelis have of Ukraine, and that of the Ukrainians have of Israel. There's no question about it that amongst large segments of the Ukrainian population and young people, that there's a great respect for Israel. Is this place that in the 1960s was surrounded by all of these enemies, and this little tiny country stood up and fought and survived? Well, you know, for anyone in the world looking at this, is, well, this is, you know, you don't have to be macho to have a respect for such people who are able to survive to this present day. And because they are ever vigilant in all aspects of their society, because of the constant threat, this can and does become a model for Ukrainians. I mean, they were surrounded by 4 or 5 or 6 Arab states. We were only surrounded by one semi-competent power in the Northeast. So, you know, all things considered, we can maybe fight on one front at a time instead of 3 or 4. So yeah, the attitudes that now have changed, certainly on the part of Ukrainians, on the part of Israelis toward Ukraine, that is still a work in progress, one might say. With regard to the street naming, monuments, and other uses of the historical past, because history really is there for us to use and misuse. That's what it is. I'm reminded when I grew up, actually, directly over there, maybe no more than 10 kilometers on the other side of the river, in the 1950s. And I remember when growing up that February was always one of the best months, because there were 2 holidays in February and you didn't have to go to school. And those holidays were Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday. Now they've combined it into one holiday called, what, President's Day, I think, in this country. But in the old days, 2. Lo and behold, when we were in some kind of orchestra representing our junior high school, we went to Washington, D.C., and we had this kind of national competition, and we met all these guys from the South. And I lo and behold discovered they only have one holiday in February. It's Washington's birthday. Forget Lincoln, you gotta be kidding. He doesn't exist. And so, I use that analogy. Why? Because every society, as an individual, as a community, as a region, has a right to honor who they feel they want to honor. And sometimes who they want to honor is not necessarily appreciated in other parts of, let's say, the country in which they live. So, you know, after the carpetbag experience, are we going to push Lincoln down the Southerners' throats? No, they don't want to celebrate it. They don't have to celebrate it. But for the North and the rest of the country, this was a hero. Similarly, I remember in Odessa, when I first started going there up on top of the steps, you know, from those famous steps in the Potemkin film, there was a statue that was all blocked off because it was under reconstruction. This was a statue of Catherine II. the founder, the inspiration behind the creation of Odessa. And this is the person who effectively founded the city. I mean, is it natural that the citizens of Odessa are somehow going to give praise to this person? The statue was built by under the Tsarist times already. But whatever, it's now being reconstructed. And at this time, elements from other parts of Ukraine said, this is terrible, Catherine II was no good, Shevchenko, what he says about her, etc., etc. How is this possible? You can't do this. Well, why can't you do it? If the local community decides that this is their hero, or in this case, heroine, then so be it. And so analogously, I would say that in the native village of Stepanbandera, if the locals want to honor this person, that is their prerogative. And whoever disagrees outside of that community, within the same country or in other parts of the world, well, either they don't get any response, or the response will be an explanation, some of which you've just touched on. That if we're going to engage in across-the-board criticism, then before any decisions are made, let's look into the nuances of the story. So I'm not opposed to having statues literally of anybody. You know, the interesting one was actually in Yalta. When they decided to put the statue, Yalta, this land in Ukraine that is temporarily occupied, but a decision was made to put up a statue outside the palace of the three. So we were building a statue which included not only Roosevelt and Churchill, but also Stalin. You know, so this becomes, having a discussion with a historian, where does one draw the line? Do we tolerate everything? Probably I would close my eyes on that statue, but I would not necessarily agree with the citizens of whatever the town is on the border with Germany that had they decided to put up a statue of Hitler. I think there are some limits to where one should go. But in general, again, each community has the right to laud praise on whom they want. In that context, though, I find the decision, maybe it's probably picked up from Soviet times, to have national heroes of Ukraine. Now that's idiocy. How can a national hero would have implies that everyone in the country of all walks of life, shapes, are in agreement on a national hero? That's not wise, and there's no necessity to do it. But in local communities, have a street name, have a statue, have a plaque, whatever you want.
Let's move on, because I know that this is an issue that can get us diverted, because we saw how emotional the discussion of remaining Confederate monuments in the South are to this day. Safe to say that this is an issue that confronts mature democracies as well as young democracies.
Absolutely.
So let's kind of withdraw this part of this to the end and open the floor to a few questions. Please be mindful, if you want to make a comment, yes, but try to put it into about a minute or so that we can have answers to your comments or questions.
Fantastic talk, really wonderful. Got the book already, so thank you so much, Professor. My question is, it's very, I am from Australia, but I'm Ukrainian background. Look, whenever you meet...
I'm sorry, why don't we use this mic to pass around, and
Okay.
then we'll share this one.
Okay, so my question is, being of Ukrainian background, whenever you meet a Jewish person and you say I'm Ukrainian, there's an immediate, you're stereotyped as, you know, you're anti-Semitic, your forebears killed Jews in the pogrom. Why do Ukrainians get the whole brunt of that very black and white pejorative flavour? Why did Ukraine cop that?
Well, every community has pecking orders, and pardon. Every community has a pecking order with regard to stereotypes of other peoples, and the Jews obviously have a pecking order. I believe that among the worst for them are not Ukrainians. I think the Lithuanians beat them out a little bit. But for the longest time, I mean, Jews had this also, many Jewish people would have also a reaction against Poles this way. Ukrainians probably more so than Poles, and the reason being, one possible reason being is that until recently Ukraine was not a state, whereas Poland had some cachet historically. People know about Polish history and culture, even some North Americans, some from the British world as well, select few, but nonetheless. Whereas, who knows about Ukraine? This is not even a state. This is just a region somewhere. So how can one not have any particular respect for it? It is, however, a very interesting question. I'm not aware, this doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, of any studies that have been done precisely as to why there is this visceral reaction on the part of some Jewish people toward Ukraine and toward Ukrainians. What made them allegedly enter their memory as being particularly bad? Any worse than the Germans, by the way? But again, you have to have respect for Germany. Germany's a powerful place. And besides, Germany's paying them reparations on an individual basis as well as a societal basis. But I'm not, why there is this, because what you've described is absolutely the case. It's absolutely the case.
Can I offer some thoughts? I think that societies that go through an open discussion of the past in all of its dimensions, I think, begin to reveal the qualities of tolerance and understanding that can help tone down that. And I think that the absence of, well, there was some diaspora, there were diaspora historians who were working, but they had such a large territory to cover in the absence of any truth being written about Ukrainian history in the Soviet period, that we're only now at this sort of period where real history is being written in all of its dimensions. And when you're writing about moments of glory, as you could also write, it's more easy to write about moments of, inglory, as it were. And I think that the more Ukrainian scholars address some of these issues, the more I think Jewish scholars will address the other side of it. For example, this Bukovinian period, or the fact that 2 million Jews moved from Central Europe into what is today Ukraine over the course of about 150 years. Maybe it's a little bit less than that. A very large migration, and then you have to ask the question, were they suicidal, or were they going to a place where there was more opportunity, where there was more safety, and they were, in a sense, fleeing from a less hospitable environment. So all these are complicated stories, and they're extremely important for us to know. We need to know these things, so when you are confronted by these kinds of stereotypes, you can engage people and say it's a much more varied history. It's a much more complicated history. I had in the early 1980s, when Solidarity came into existence, one of my responsibilities, I was working to support this movement, was to travel and meet with Jewish community organizations to convince them of the nature of this movement as a liberal and tolerant movement, because the typical thing was, Jews got their anti-Semitism with their mother's milk, and we've heard that phrase applied to several organizations, several Poles rather. Poles got their anti-Semitism others don't. And we had to explain these issues. There were, I sat with, survivors of the Holocaust who had their own historiography. These were painful discussions, but what we tried to convey in these discussions were that, first of all, there were Jewish activists and leaders in this movement. It was an extremely tolerant movement, and it was pushing for democracy. And great leaders like Bronislaw Karatnycky, who was the foreign minister of Poland, who was a great intellectual that supported solidarity, and Adam Michnik, who became the publishing mogul and was one of the leading intellectuals. These were pillars of that movement. So it's not just about Ukraine. And somehow Poland got over it for a while, and now in a more conservative government, the controversy, the pendulum has shifted a bit, and now there are more controversies, I would say historiographic controversies between Poland's attempt to just sanitize its history and Ukraine, which I think has a bit more of a, at this point, is at a stage of greater openness to discuss things, both heroic and not so heroic.
Just one quick thing. When you face this question in the future, and you will, the last literally 4 or 5 paragraphs in this book, Jews and Ukrainians, you can give them a mathematical response. And the simple math is, it's about 1,500 years of Jewish life on Ukrainian territory. Out of those 1,500 years, or even if we take the last 500 years, 16 to 18 years out of that total, there were periods of crisis and disruption. Only 16 to 18. And what about the rest? They weren't going, Jews were not going to Ukraine because they were suicidal or they were masochists. But we never hear about those others because this is a fixation only, as human nature, on tragedy and destruction. That's what we like. We're all sick in that sense.
Yeah, if I may, I have a question to our main presenter. Professor, as far as I remember, please correct me if I'm wrong, at the beginning of your presentation, you stated that Ukrainian Jews from Ukraine, refer to them as themselves, call themselves Russians, or Russian Jews. Could you please give us reference to some studies, sources, statistical data which would support this statement? For example, I've heard quite often when Ukrainian Jews from Ukraine would call them Ukrainian Jews from Ukraine, and I believe I'm not the only one. So could you please provide us some?
Well, I hope that your experience is the more common one, but I would suggest that it's not. We're here now in the realm of what we would call superficial analysis, because I am unaware of statistical studies in which sociologists have done surveys of people in North America, and I'm referring to North America here, and people of Jewish background, and ask them, where their ancestors come from. Such studies may exist, I do not know. I have lived a little over 7 decades, and in an area in which I have interacted with Jewish people, or people of Jewish background, in school, in university, in jobs, to this very day. If you ask somebody of Jewish background, or they engage in a conversation, where they come from, they generally don't know. They'll say somewhere in Eastern Europe, or they will say, oh, my grandparents are Polish Jews, or my grandparents are Russian Jews. Invariably, I have never, in over 7 decades of my life, heard anyone say that my parents or my grandparents came from Ukraine and are Ukrainian Jews. Never.
And I've heard a lot of that.
Well, and that's good, then fine.
You're not
Yes.
talking to the right people.
Okay.
Exactly.
I have been somewhat taken aback by the negativity of otherwise an excellent presentation. The focus has been on the negative. I was happy to hear that Mr. Karatnycky supplemented your talk with some positive aspects, mentioning, for example, Magocsi. And my question is, as far as the book is concerned, is it also focusing primarily on the negative? Because there are so many positive things that could have mentioned today. For example, there is the fact that in Galicia, a Jewish battalion was formed during the struggle for independence, and this Jewish battalion of 1,000 men joined the Ukrainian side rather than the Polish. So my impression is that it is precisely because we tend to focus on the negative. This is, so to speak, the more, we should not be surprised by the reaction. And my impression is that we historians should actually present the picture as closely as it has been.
Well, there is no answer because that is my answer, and we wrote a whole book. Actually, to be quite honest with you, I felt that the least important part of this book, Jews and Ukrainians, is the chapter on history. And given a choice and based on what I've just said before, who needs history? Political history. I'm being somewhat facetious. One has to have context. The bulk of this book is about economic life, traditions, folklore, literature, painting, music, all of the arts in which were created both by ethnic Ukrainians and by Jews on this territory. I would argue and venture to say that this is one of the few books that makes ethnic Ukrainians and Ukraine look good. Done in a beautiful splash with color and choosing the most outstanding achievements that have occurred on that territory. That's what this book is about. But unfortunately, you're absolutely correct. People aren't interested in that. Even those who read the book, we never get discussions about the interaction between Jewish folk music and Ukrainian folk music. How many Ukrainian melodies are in klezmer music? No one talks about that because you don't care. You would just want to know about collaboration. You just want to know about how many people on your side were killed. Unfortunately, that's the case. This book is very positive. It's about as positive as you're going to get. And just because we're not having a conversation about it, well, that's because most people are not interested in, as you correctly pointed out.
Okay. Can I just, two comments about two people who've already spoke. So what you just said, I think in her defense, your talk was not about what you just said. So your talk, unlike perhaps the book, was focused on other things.
Correct.
With respect to your question, my feeling is that, first of all, it's not just Ukrainians, as was just mentioned. Jews have this feeling about a lot of Eastern Europe, and it's not just about the Holocaust. There is a history before the Holocaust that comes in here. So it's not just collaboration or that. Yeah, I mean, the word anti-Semitism is kind of the thing that you got to focus on. But I have a question in terms of context of what we've been talking about, and it's about population. Can you give us some figures on population, both percentage-wise and in actual numbers of Jews in Ukraine before and after the two world wars?
In the interwar period, I think the first census that was taken by the Soviet Union in 1926 on the territory of Soviet Ukraine, there were about 2 million Jews. The numbers today are around 80,000. But it's not, well, let me just elaborate just a little bit in answer to your question. During the German invasion of the Soviet Union after June 1941, the Soviets immediately carried out an incredibly large evacuation procedure. It took place mostly in central and eastern Ukraine because the Germans were moving so rapidly in this blitzkrieg, so it couldn't affect western Ukrainian lands, but central and eastern Ukrainian lands it did. And where they dismantled, hundreds and hundreds of factories and shipped them to the east, and evacuated close to 3.8 million people, primarily officials in the government, managerial staff, professors, etc. And that is the reason why, after the war, about 800,000 of these people who were Jews returned to Ukraine. So the numbers of Jews after the war, Jews were not wiped out in Ukraine as a result of the Holocaust. These people returned. And so there was a significant Jewish population. The traditional mode of Jewish life was destroyed, that's for sure, certainly in the West under Soviet rule, in Western Ukraine under Soviet rule. But physically, Jews in the post-World War II statistic were now pushing up to 1 million or so. Since the 1970s, with the Refusnik movement, and then since the independence of Ukraine, large numbers of Jews, for that matter, large numbers of ethnic Ukrainians, the population of Ukraine in general has declined, like maybe 4 or 5 million. Actually, it's crazy. Between the 1989 census and the 2001 census, and then the estimates of today, still on another census. So the number of Jews has declined substantially, and there are probably maybe only about 80,000, 100,000 left. But it's not a direct result of the Holocaust.
Can I say, in the Soviet period after the war, there were about, at the time of the height of the Jewish Refusnik movement and the migration aliyah, there were about 1.5 to 1.8 million people of Jewish or partly Jewish origin in the Soviet Union.
Soviet Ukraine.
Soviet Union. I don't know what the statistics were for Ukraine, but it was probably about 500,000 or
even more. Yeah.
So it was a reasonably. It was not like Poland where there were like 5,000 to 10,000 Jews at the end, partly because of this evacuation, partly because the front held, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was a different.
And in terms of the total population of Ukraine, what is today Ukraine?
So today Ukraine has a population of about 46.
Well, no, 42. Yeah.
Because part of it is occupied, under Ukraine's authority, it's probably about 40 million, probably a little over. But as you may have read in the Times this week, there are 2 million Ukrainians today working in Poland, and there are about another million working in Italy and Portugal as guest workers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's Ukraine has not conducted a census in 17 years, so we don't really know. The Jewish community in Ukraine claims there are about 170,000 Jews, so the statistic of 80,000 may not itself be accurate, and their estimate may not be accurate. There's also the phenomenon of people who emigrated. I have a lot of Jewish friends in Kiev where I spend a lot of time, who were living in Israel for many years, and they, for reasons of business or for family reasons, they've re-immigrated, or they divide their time. You know, it's a 2-hour and 15-minute flight, 2.5-hour flight between Kiev and Tel Aviv. So it's very easy. There are about 8 or 9 flights a day. They're very inexpensive. You know, there are budget airlines as well. So there's a huge movement back and forth.
I suppose I'm the outlier of your 7 decades. Hi, Adrian.
Outlier of the what?
An outlier of your 7 decades. I never have met
Oh.
a Jew who says they come from Ukraine.
Ah, good.
I'm a
So you're the
Jew.
second one.
I'm a Jew. I guess I'm the second,
Yeah, yeah.
but I don't know who you've been talking to. My family, my father's family comes from a village in present-day Ukraine, which is called Ekaterinoslav, which is now Dnipropetrovsk. My mother's family comes from a village that still exists in western Ukraine called Ananya. They weren't Lithuanian Jews, they weren't Polish Jews, they weren't Russian Jews, they were Ukrainian Jews. And the identity is important to many of us. So the fact that you haven't met people like me concerns me. To answer the woman's question, I can only go by my own history and understanding. I have spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I have worked in Ukraine. But I do have this innate feeling of a nationalist anti-Semitism from the Ukrainian nation, if you will. Why is that? Why even less so than Poland or some of the other countries? One has to do with history, as the gentleman was saying. I'm not entirely certain, but I know from my own family's history that the pogroms mostly took place in modern-day Ukraine. They didn't happen in Poland. They certainly didn't happen in Galicia. And really were not happening so much in Russia as they happened in Ukraine. So the history, the pre-Shoah history of Ukraine, again, not 1,500-year history, and I understand that. And why are we dwelling on only the last 100 years? That's a reasonable question, but it has a very simple answer, because that's the history that is most near to us. And that history is not kind, hasn't been kind to Ukrainian Jews. Pre-Shoah, and then during the Shoah. In Lithuania, in other areas, but especially in Ukraine, the collaboration in the murder of Jews was especially widespread. Unlike in Poland, where the Germans were basically committing mass murder on their own in the camps, in Ukraine, the Ukrainian populace was assisting the Einsatzgruppen to dig the ditches and murder Jews. And they did that also, I have to point out, very willingly in Lithuania and in Latvia. But the third reason why Ukraine is singled out is sheer numbers. There were literally millions and millions of Jews that were murdered with collaboration by the local populace. And And that didn't take place in sheer numbers in other countries. Except in Poland, where again, it was really perpetrated predominantly by the Germans, even though there was. So there are reasons, and lastly, you yourself said that there really hasn't been scholarly study of collaboration. We haven't had access to the records. We haven't had an understanding of that. And again, why are we dwelling on the negative? Well, you have to remember that Jewish life as we knew it and have known it for millennia no longer exists because of the recent history. So it's understandable why we're dwelling on the negative, because that history is essentially over.
The only sort of comment I would make is that there is this experience of the Nazi occupation. If you talk, you probably did when you were in Ukraine, very many people had the experience of some people in their family being victims, whether in combat or of atrocities or collateral damage from wars or shootings, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that has created a different kind of discourse in Ukraine. And the other thing that I think is a bit of a wrinkle in this, and that is that Hitler did not want the Ukrainians as collaborators. He did not want them as partners in the way that he accepted the Croatians or he accepted other, and that was for two reasons. One, the racial theory, which Tim Snyder talks about in Bloodlines, that the Ukrainians were the initial people that were slated. 1/3 of Ukrainians were to be exterminated, 1/3 were to be driven out across the Urals, and 1/3 were to be chattel or slave labor to work the farms. And so, the thesis, there were just too many of them, and there was resistance and war. So he moved to the second racial category that he wanted to eliminate the Jewish population. But that the initial aim was first to purge, to depopulate Ukraine, to make it a rural area, to provide for the food needs of the right. And the part of this mentality was integrated into the German occupation, which was extremely cruel to the Ukrainian population. And those people who collaborated are not regarded as heroes today by Ukraine. In fact, those nationalist heroes who are celebrated today, Ukrainians go out of their way, paradoxically, to point out that they were themselves imprisoned. Of course, they don't talk about the fact that in the 1930s they were wannabes. They wanted to be partners in the new order as an independent Ukrainian state, but because Hitler didn't want them, the other reason he didn't want them was because he remembered the disloyalty of the Ukrainians to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and as an Austrian, he felt Ukrainians were a terribly unreliable ally. So it's a much more, I'd say, nuanced. And as to the Einsatzgruppen and the exterminations, there are studies that have been done that show that the vast majority of the killing was done by German forces. Ukrainians were enlisted in gathering people and so on, and there were pogroms and killings and mass killings, but they probably amounted to 10 or 15%. I mean, that's still a horrific figure of 100,000 or 200,000, which could be attributed to Ukrainian actions, but the vast majority of the 1.5 million people who died in the Holocaust by bullets, as opposed to the Ukrainian Jews who were part of Poland, who were moved to the extermination camps, who were industrially destroyed. The vast majority of those were done. I think Jeff Kopstein is a scholar in California who has done these studies, and he's concluded that they were mobilized and instrumentalized by the Germans, except in the initial period in some of the villages there were these pogrom events.
May I just say one more thing, Adrian? Forgive me.
Sure.
Also, when I was in Ukraine, and I believe it still goes on. A lot of Ukrainian nationalists will lionize some of the Cossack leaders. That still goes on today. It certainly was going on in the 90s and past the millennium when I was there.
Yeah.
And those were the leaders who were raping and murdering my grandparents' family. So there's a direct connection between that issue, if you will, the historical and the current. And that doesn't happen in other countries, or that, as far as I know,
Well,
to the same extent.
It depends, I don't know what you mean by Cossacks. If you mean the 17th and 18th century phenomenon, then you have a different set of ethics. So Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who was a leader under whom pogroms occurred, was an equal opportunity pogromchik against Poles and against Ukrainians who were Catholics. He was basically exterminating non-Orthodox believers in a non-discriminatory way. So the history is a little bit more complicated. But if you go back to, say, the fighting in the First World War and the Revolution, which continued into the early 1920s, you had anarchists who were engaged in pogroms. You had Bolsheviks who were attacking bourgeois Jews or religious Jews who were also victimized. And you had, yes, Ukrainian nationalists, but the most interesting thing about the interwar Ukrainian state, which didn't last very long, was one, that it had several Jewish members of that state. Petlura, who is regarded as a pogromchik, in fact had military tribunals against warlords who were conducting these pogroms, who were under his nominal control but were not fully under his control, and he maybe acted slowly to deal with this, but eventually he did. But he began as a philo-Semite. He was a social democrat, and there was a whole Ukrainian social democratic tradition of philo-Semitic activism and interaction with Jewish bunds and Jewish socialist organizations in the period. So it's a much more, I would say, all the things you say are part of the truth, but there are also other, I wouldn't call them mitigating, but other parts of the discourse that are not heard. And I think that the tension in the discourse is that only one part of that past is heard, but other parts need to be also heard, not to expunge that reality, but to have an understanding that there were very many different people. I mean, for example, Ukrainian nationalists from the Bandera movement, as opposed to the Millennium movement, were immediately, within a week of they declared their own independent state without asking anybody. And Hitler gave the order to wipe them out. And some of their leaders were arrested, and then about 4,000 of them were exterminated as enemies of the German occupation. This is a nuance. It doesn't mean that some of them weren't anti-Semitic. Some of them were actually, saved Jewish lives. Some of them had Jewish wives. So it was a kind of a very diverse movement, but it did have the elements of a kind of a racial nationalism, and that needs to be discussed and it needs to be criticized. But then that movement evolved away from that, as some other political movements of the 1930s morphed into other sets of values. So all I'm saying is nothing that you have said is not true, but there are also other dimensions of that experience. And I would say that the Ukrainian collaboration, in my view, was not fundamentally different. I mean, there was fairly substantial Polish collaboration as well, and I think the more scholars are examining that, I mean, Poland was perceived as a victim nation because it was invaded, but there were also large numbers of Poles after the invasion that collaborated. The question of collaboration, which is addressed in your book, is an interesting one for Ukrainians. Could Ukrainians be collaborators because they were not a state. They were individuals. They were betraying the Polish state or the Soviet state, and if they didn't feel that was their state, where they actually collaborated. They were cooperating, but collaboration, I think, carries the sort of the element of betrayal of your own nation, your own state. If you didn't identify with that state, is cooperation with that state. It's also morally can be subjected to criticism, but I think it's a different kind of a thing for in the case of stateless people.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you, both of you. Certainly, I now know about what Galicianas were, because in my family that was a dirty word. You were, it was the Galiciana. However, on a more serious note, since Ukraine is now 40 million people, I'd like to know what proportion of that population are young people, and where do they see their alliances? You mentioned that they feel a strong alliance to Israel. How do they feel about us in America, Europe, and Russia? And what do they produce?
Do you mean the Jewish population in Ukraine or the broader population?
The entire, I imagine at this point,
So Ukraine
nationalist.
Ukraine has a demographic problem of the kind that Russia has, and the United States. I don't know all the exact breakdown of this, but first of all, the Ukrainian population is aging. Secondly, it hasn't been replacing itself, so it's skewed. The typical point for a growing economy is a population at the age range of 21 to 45. That's when people are the most dynamic in terms of spending, activity, contributing, et cetera, et cetera. The United States has about 30% of its population in that percentile. And in Ukraine and in Russia, it's about 20%. By the way, China is somewhere in between that because of its one-child policy. It's facing the same kinds of demographic problems. But I mentioned the Jewish campaigning, the guy who's ahead in the polls as elections loom on Sunday in Kiev, Vladimir Zelensky, a comedian and political satirist. He derives about 50 to 60, he takes about 60, there are 39 candidates, and he's running polling at about 25 or 30%. But he's getting 60% of the vote of people 30 and under. And I think that's also a kind of a sense that in the post, these are the people who were born after Ukraine was independent. So I think something has happened in the culture that has moved it away. And the support, the nationalist candidate in this election, who is not really an anti-Semite, but he's, has that historical mythology, is polling 1%. And there's a far-right neo-Nazi group. They have a few thousand young members. They basically pay for themselves by a graft and criminal activity and bank robberies and so on. And they sustain a small network of people whom they recruit from, football hooligans or football fanatics, ultras as they're called, and inculcated in them some racist ideas. But these are more and more fringe phenomena, and there's a sort of a pretty strong culture of tolerance that has developed in the country. And again, ethnicity is not an issue, and I would also say that even though Russia is an invading force, there is no hint of anti-Russian sentiment in the Ukrainian population, really to a very surprising degree. So that's the sort of the temperament of the country. It's, people are angry, but they're not angry at the outside world or scapegoating people. They're angry at their political leaders for not having moved them sufficiently far in the direction of greater, I would say, economic growth There's unhappiness about corruption, and there's unhappiness about oligarchy, meaning excessive concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few people.
Just a quick comment on this, regardless of the actual percentage of the cohort of people between 21 and 45, the most important thing is, in a sense, the 30-year-old bracket. That is, you asked a question about young people, younger than 30, what are their views of the United States, what are their kind of political views, what are their cultural values? Well, I can say without question that this is the greatest hope for Ukraine, and that the vast majority of people who are younger than 30, who have had no experience living within the Soviet Union, are Europeans. If you interact with them, as I do very broadly, in all parts of the country, not just in Lviv and here, and visitors who come here, you cannot tell the difference whether someone from Ukraine could be from Germany or from Norway or from Italy. They have the same look, the same dress, the same ideals, the same cultural values. I wouldn't say that, like many Europeans, that means toward America. America is no longer kind of an ideal world that everyone would like to be associated with, and certainly not in the last several years, in which it's embarrassing, let alone not ideal. But Ukrainians, certainly of that generation, are Europeans to the full extent. And that is the hope of the country. Because regardless of their potential in the cohort, the generation raised in the Soviet Union, 10 years they're gone. Goodbye.
I would like to reinforce that comment, but also to mention that last year I spent a considerable amount of time in Ukraine advising the Lviv National Polytechnic University on technical aspects of historic preservation. So I'd like to shift this conversation a little bit more to the arts, and would just like to mention that there were many, many young Ukrainians who have an interest not only in their ethnic history, but the history of the individuals, the communities that they lived alongside with over a historical period. So consequently, for example, this evening you mentioned the town of Zhokva. Well, Zhokva had one of the most magnificent synagogues in all of Eastern Europe, which I saw, which was a complete ruin. So my specialty is in fact historic preservation. So my question to both of you is, other than actual monuments per se, is there an interest in preserving the actual remnants of a civilization that no longer exists in Ukraine? Last spring, when I was in Lviv, there were 3 major exhibitions devoted to Jewish art and heritage and culture at the local museums. So within that context, I just want to ask, what possibilities are there for the future? Because there are many Americans of Jewish ancestry who travel to Ukraine, who work on the cemeteries, who restore the buildings of their individual small villages or towns that they can trace their lineage to. And I think that's a wonderful possibility for the future.
The answer is, part of this is a matter of resources. The country is rather poor. It is fighting a war. It's spending 5% of GDP right now on its military, and it carries a huge debt burden. Ukraine has a broad external debt, which is not quite equal, it's about 80% of its GDP. So it is heavily leveraged or leveraged. It has to make payments this year of about 15% of GDP in principal and interest. So that's a huge drain on both spare money and it has very high levels of poverty which get in the way of that. That said, in some communities, sometimes by members of the Jewish diaspora, but often in combination with Ukrainian volunteers, there are efforts to restore cemeteries. There, in Chernovitz, there was a renovation of a synagogue. Certainly, the major functioning synagogues in Kiev have been restored, maybe not to their complete formal glory, but significantly restored. There has been a restitution of scrolls and of historical relics that used to be in the museums of atheism. Some of them have been returned to religious communities, but it's a huge task. There's also the problem of the proper memorialization of killing fields and so on. But you also have to understand that the same problem applies to the killing fields of the Stalin era Ukrainians. There's an under-resourcing of not just memorialization, but of proper documentation of many places of tragedies that occurred in the early 1930s on through 1945.
And just real quickly on that subject, I think it's a very important one. I'll be very brief. I don't think one necessarily has to depend on the state of intervention here. The Ukrainian state, for some of the reasons that Adrian has just said, is maybe incapable of being able to do that, even if they wanted to. But there's enough grassroots efforts on the part of individuals, and certainly individuals of ethnic Ukrainian background, some of whom have been most active in restoring and pushing forward the Jewish restoration of the Jewish part of Lviv. Again, getting funds from the European Union, from other resources. This is taking place. And if anything, to be honest with you, more attention is being given to Jewish monuments of the past than to other monuments. This didn't take place in Crimea during the 20 years before the Russian presence. No one was concerned about Crimean Tatar monuments, certainly at the grassroots level. And in Poland, amongst, how much effort is being done to restore Polish monuments in Western Ukraine? Jewish get more attention, actually, and relatively large amount.
So we are at an end almost. We have time for one more question.
Just a comment on the identity thing. Obviously, during the Russian Empire, there was Galicia and there was Russia. So if somebody asks you where you're from, they're going to say Russia. They're not going to say Belarus, or they're not going to say something else. After the 1917, then you get an identity that is Ukrainian, and that most people would agree with. And one example is when the Polish Jewish refugees left Poland in 1939 for Ukraine. There's a poet called Izzy Hadek, who was very much of a Marxist, and he wrote a poem saying, "Welcome to Ukraine." He didn't have to say Ukraine. He could have said Soviet Union, he could have said something else, but he used the word Ukraine. There's another poet, Mani Leib, who wrote a poem about him, contrasting himself with a Litvak poet living here in New York. And describing himself, he says, "I wear like the shirt on my back the song of joy of the Ukrainian Black Earth." You can't get more Ukrainian than that. The song of joy of the Ukrainian Black Earth. So that's the point one. I think after 1917, you do get a Ukrainian identity, even with the Jews. The second point is that there were regional differences, and Mani Leib, who came from Nizhyn, went around saying, well, look, I can't help it if I'm from a region that Jews and Gentiles got along pretty well. That was one of the things he would say. Nobody would believe him. He said, that's the way it was. Okay, these are the 2 points there. I think most people, most American Jews really don't know their geography, but part of the reason is that they came before, their parents came before 1917.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a very lively and I think constructive discussion.